Many people argue, mistakenly I would say, that the progenitor of the Trafficante crime family was a man named Ignazio Antinori. Now I would say that this man actually was Ignazio Italiano, who was an elderly man when he died in 1932. The reason that people look towards Antinori is because he has that sexy mob boss appeal. He had assassins, shotgun killings, a turf war with public officials under Charlie Wall, but Ignazio Italiano was already an older man when he migrated here to Tampa. He was born in 1860, and when he saw the corruption of Charlie Wall, he realized it should be possible to simply have legal alcohol production and to get a stranglehold on it by making deals with city officials. And because of this, he took underneath his wing Ignazio Antinori, who was beleaguered from his battles with Charlie Wall and had lost probably dozens of men. And he took under his other arm a very young Santo Trafficante Sr. And when he died in 1932, Ignazio Antinori continued fighting with Charlie Wall, and Santo Trafficante Sr. had taken in his business mentality and stepped back to the sidelines while other organized crime figures assassinated each other. And by the 1960s, Trafficante had risen to prominence simply by watching everything play out and having a calculating attitude from the sidelines. 1802 North Tampania Avenue. This is the old home of Ignazio Italiano. He, of course, organized some crime circles and he had rackets going with the Bolitas, but he wanted to keep things strictly business. So whereas the Antinoris very quickly died off and many of his sons and relatives were killed, Ignazio Italiano had a very young Santo Trafficante underneath his wing. And when he died at a very early age in the time frame of the Tampa Mafia in the 1930s, of course, Santo Trafficante was only left with Antinori, and Antinori was at that time engaged in a more or less turf war with Charlie Wall, and Santo Trafficante came out on top. This is 2513 15th Street, Tampa, Florida, and on the night of June 17th, 1931, 3 young men died very mysteriously here in the basement of a man named Frank Napoli, where he kept his alcohol. The coroner said that the 3 boys were going to retrieve some bottles when it seems like they were killed by a mysterious poison gas. I believe this was involved in some form of organized crime because one of the men killed was Paul Antinori, and he was only 18 years old, the son of the Antinori family. Furthermore, Tony Desu actually retrieved one of the bodies, the newspaper article didn't say which one it was, and dropped it off at a hospital before fleeing because he didn't want to talk to the police. Now, after this, the man who owned this area, Frank Napoli, he wasn't killed, so I don't think that he intended for the 3 boys to die, but he was continually raided by the Vice Squad, and his businesses shut down from lack of service later. So it seems like he just didn't have any control over what was happening and had really improper conditions for the storage of his alcohol. By 1933, the man who owned the cellar, Frank, was in bankruptcy and consistently just not really achieving any business success. And it should be pointed out at the grave of Paul Antinori that his father, Vincenzo Antinori, was the secretary of the Italian club around which many of these activities were centered. It was a central meeting point for most of the Italian families in Florida. And this is 705 East Plymouth Street in Tampa. In the early 1950s, after the assassination of his father Ignazio, Joe Antinori was hunted by those who didn't want the Antinori family rising again to prominence in the organized crime community. In August of 1953, he was shot in Ybor City, but ducked into a bar, clutching his revolver, and called an ambulance. Months later, in November, he was murdered in a mafia-style hit. Much like his father Ignazio, the killer shotgunned him from the back of the head when he wasn't paying attention. Papers at the time were filled with speculation, but it was apparently an open secret that both Antinori boys were totally out of the game, or at least not dealing in narcotics anymore, at least not openly. By 1950, James Lumia was already a very well-known figure in the Italian community here in Florida and all across the U.S. He was an eminent businessman, an entrepreneur, and he bettered the community as a whole. He also had organized crime endeavors, and so they called him the head of the Elks, or the leader of the Italian Mafia here in Florida. And one of the things he did to cement his alliance with broader Italian families was marry Mary Desu, of course the sister of Frank Desu, another leader of organized crime in the Sunshine State. Now, on June 5th, 1950, on 19th Street, a car pulled up alongside his at the intersection, and the two men sitting next to him in the car, who were essentially his private security, both gave conflicting statements to the police and couldn't be bothered to remember the license plate number, but somebody fired a shot and struck him in the face, which was a classic mob-style assassination. After this, the Santo Trafficante family rose to prominence, and obviously I don't think Santo Trafficante did it, but it is fascinating to note how the Trafficantes rose to prominence because other people were too eager to fight. Charlie Wall and Antinori fought, and they both depleted their men, and eventually Lumia was assassinated, and after all of this, Santo Trafficante, who preferred to keep a strong business mentality, he was sitting on the sidelines, and he knew that his turn was coming up and rapidly approaching. In 1938, James Lumia and his wife Mary Desu lost their first son, 10-year-old Alfonso, followed 5 years later by his brother, Sam, and unable to bear the memories that they had made with their two young children here at 3215 12th Street, they moved out of the house just around the corner for a little bit of break from the memories that they had formed. And this is the last recorded address of James Lumia before he was killed in 1950. It's at 1020 25th Avenue here in Tampa. And if I remember correctly, this looks very similar to some of the photos that were shown in the newspapers regarding Lumia's assassination. Very interesting that it hasn't changed all that much. Last time I was in Tampa talking about the Trafficante crime family, I noticed that the head and arms of the statues overlooking the Madini family plot were broken off, and I said that this might have been done for some political reason because Nick Madini died in World War II and a lot of Italians were somewhat divided over that war. Now, I actually learned since that Pat Madini, Nick's father, had worked very closely with Joe Bamy, who was one of the top guys underneath Santo Trafficante, and days after the assassination of James Lumia, the cops were looking to round up anybody in the Italian crime community and bring them in for questioning. So usually they would just say that you look suspicious hanging out at the street corner. And Joe Bamy with Pat Madini were just doing that. They were just standing on the corner of the street when they got picked up by the cops, and apparently Pat Madini lost his nerve and just told all. He really opened up to the police, and because of that, he was pretty much ousted from the community, and he died in 1935. And you can see over his grave, the statues of Jesus and the statues of saints have their arms and their heads, and even the children have their heads knocked off. So this was very clearly a message sent to the Madini family, courtesy of the Trafficantes. And John Zambito here is one of the men who died in the bloody feuds and turf wars between different mafia factions in the early 1930s. I wasn't able to find out much about who exactly killed him, but I did find a chilling photo from the newspaper that showed men in black face masks with white berets who were seen assassinating him. And I think that it's another fascinating story of a life cut short, very sadly. And this is the Liata family plot here in the Italian Union Cemetery in Tampa. It doesn't have anything to do with organized crime as far as anybody knows, but in 1933, Victor Liata killed 5 members of his family with an axe on a marijuana bender. So the federal government, of course, used this in propaganda to claim that marijuana fiends were being created by mobsterism and gangsterism in places like Tampa and Ybor City, and used it to make the drug highly, highly illegal. And Victor Liata, died in a mental ward in 1950 and is buried in an unmarked grave in the Florida Panhandle. And in the back of the cemetery, you have the family plots of the Desus and Lazaras, specifically the first-generation immigrants. And on the top left is Alfonso Desu, who was a man with his interests in both the above-ground business world as well as the underground world. It must be remembered most of these men had deep ties to the community and to civic life here in Tampa and Ybor. Angelo Lazara was known to police as someone who was an early member of the Trafficante family collecting graft from the Bolitas in Tampa and Ybor City, and in 1931 he was assassinated because he became aware of an arson plot that was known to all of the local mafia residents. He took this to the police, and the newspapers outright just named him and gave his address, and he died a very, very short time later. And behind James Lumia, we have a later leader of the Trafficante family, Angelo Primo Lazara. Now, in 1949, he was first arrested for assault to commit murder, and then beginning in the early 1960s, he faced a number of arrests because police had discovered he was tied to the organizational structure of the Trafficante family. And he ran rackets with vending machines, pinball machines, with the Bolitas, but he tried to keep the image of himself as more of a banker of the Trafficante family, and he maintained these associations with the Trafficantes and very likely with the CIA, as I explained in my last video about the Tampa Mafia with Santo Trafficante Jr., until his death of natural causes in 1968. Vincent Loscalzo is the last boss of the Tampa crime family. For what it's worth, there's nothing left. He only has legitimate business ventures, and when I say legitimate, I do mean just business ventures. He's totally retired, and he has a couple of properties. That's pretty much it. But he was a first-generation Sicilian immigrant born to this man here, Angelo Loscalzo. They called him the Hammer, and he was a fixture on the community. To the far bottom left is Angelo Loscalzo, the father of the first-generation Sicilian immigrant who now leads the Tampa families and is no longer involved with organized crime. And above him is Antonio Loscalzo, who was an associate of the Marcello family. And it's fascinating to think that the Loscalzo family came here when the Tampa Mafia was in its very infancy and continue up to the present day, albeit the leader of it is, I believe, 87 at this point. At the time of his passing in 1975, Angelo Loscalzo was the manager of the Elwood Plantation restaurant in New Orleans, where the Loscalzo family first settled before moving to Tampa. After his death, his son Vincent began to buy more properties and bars across Ybor and Tampa proper, and meet regularly with Santo Trafficante Jr. Once Trafficante Jr. died in 1987, the FBI followed him across the country, tracking him to business meetings in Chicago, New York, New Orleans, and everywhere between. But they never really got anything on him, apart from the fact that some of his employees were selling drugs, which the police admit themselves he had no idea of. In fact, when it comes to police harassing old men, this seems to be what broke the Tampa crime families. 2 years before Trafficante's death, authorities suspended Loscalzo's business license at Mike's Lounge because his employees were dealing in stolen property. It didn't matter that he had no clue what was going on. The police said he had an absolute responsibility to watch over his employees, and they only did this because they knew he was a partner of Santo Trafficante Jr. And this is Vincent Loscalzo's old bar, Mike's Lounge at 3607 North Nebraska Avenue. This is the site where employees were found to be selling drugs in the early 1980s. And because of this, even though local police admitted to the papers that Vincent had no idea what they were doing, they said he had a full responsibility for every activity of his employers, and they revoked his business license. And at that time, Vincent had several businesses throughout Tampa, quite a few. And it really damaged him. He made up for it, but it showed that authorities were targeting him once they discovered his ties with Santo Trafficante Jr. The patriarch of the Bamy family was Angelo Bamy Sr., born in 1893 and buried here in the Italian cemetery in Tampa. He was a businessman with his sons, Ciro and Joe. Of the sons, Joe Bamy was the most business-oriented. The two worked with only occasional help from their third brother, Jimmy. In 1967, Joe was arrested for arson in Lakeland. His trial was set for 1968, and in August he set out for a barbecue and disappeared to the sands of time. He was presumed dead, but his son, Angelo Bamy Jr., who's still alive, claims he lived for decades after his appearance and died peacefully in Sicily. A prominent business family, Joe and Ciro's sister Katie married Silent Sam Loscalzo, a close associate of Santo Trafficante, and this is what officially formed a tie between the two families. I should take a second to note that Silent Sam got his name because he refused to identify anyone at a simple jury trial. For a while he was called Singing Sam because he accidentally let a little bit of information slip, but he quickly atoned for this, and he was a very well-trusted member of the family.